Sorry for the delay. Thank you for being here in our webinars, ISA webinars. Today, we are going to share the WIMUN experience. That is a unique model. That is why we have our speaker, William Yotiv, that is Model UN Coordinator for WFUNA, World Federation of United Nations Association, which we signed an MOU, and we are partners, and we are going to work in different programs. And he is also a member of the Advisory Council of the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations. So thank you very much for being there. I will be the link between the Model of United Nations, WIMUN, and the ISA schools. This activity will be our Youth Leadership Encounter, virtual Youth Leadership Encounter for 2020. So thank you very much for being there. We will answer the questions in the chat of the YouTube. So in order not to keep you waiting, I give the word to William, or in this case, Will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgardo. And let me start by saying it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk to you about our program. I'm going to divide my talk today into two parts. The first part will focus on giving you an overview of Weinman, what it is, and what's unique, and how it is different from any other Model UN that you may have experienced in your educational settings. And then the second half, I'm going to focus more on, it'll be more of a historical talk that will walk you through the evolution of the decision-making process at the UN and how it has changed over time, and why today it has embraced what's called the consensus model, which I will be going into in more detail. Just a little bit more about my background. As Edgardo said, I'm currently the Model UN coordinator for the World Federation of United Nations Associations, otherwise known as WFUNA. Prior to that, I worked for over 14 years in the UN Secretariat, where I was the manager of a program called the United Nations Global Teaching and Learning Project. In that role, I was responsible for managing the UN's educational website, which was called the UN Cyber School Bus. And I also created educational materials for schools around the world about the United Nations, or any item on the UN's agenda, which is quite vast, as you know. Another part of my responsibility during that time is I was the focal point for anything dealing with Model UN. So anytime a Model UN wrote to the UN asking for information, they would give it to me to respond to. WIMUN, the word WIMUN is also an acronym which refers to WFUNA International Model UN. And in 2009, my Undersecretary General at the time, who had participated in Model UN as a boy, wanted the UN to become more involved in Model UNs. Model UN was an NGO-led movement which began actually before the creation of the United Nations. And that has led to some of the problems that we face today about the differences between how the UN has evolved. I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, Bill, I think Maria got in.
Okay, good. So just to back up. So the Model UN was an NGO-led movement. It was not started by the UN itself. And it wasn't until 2009 when the UN became more involved by organizing the very first Model UN organized by the UN in 2009, which took place in the Palais des Nations in Geneva. That was followed up by two subsequent conferences. One was in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the third one was in Incheon in the Republic of Korea. After organizing three conferences, then we started turning our attention to training workshops, training for teachers and students, in making them aware of a new approach, which at that time was called UN Informal. What I've done is I've taken UN4MUN and I've further developed it into this approach that I now call the Weinman Approach. But the Weinman Approach grew out of the work that I did when I was still a staff member at the UN. Now, this approach is very much informed by my experience at the UN itself and being allowed to go into private consultations to see how real UN diplomats negotiate and what goes on behind the scenes during these private consultations. And so this approach, this Weinman Approach, brings the most accurate simulation of UN meetings that you will find in any of the model UNs around the world. And it's very much informed from my study of the actual UN system and how it functions today. So let's begin. What is Wyman? So Wyman is a new approach to simulating UN meetings that puts emphasis on making decisions by consensus. Now, consensus will be a very important word, which I hope you will understand better by the end of this talk. But very briefly, I will define consensus as decisions that are made without taking a vote, where all of the member states who are involved in the negotiations on a resolution continue negotiating until such point that all of the members agree on the wording of a text as a resolution, and so there is no need to vote. It is a much longer process than making decisions by voting, but the UN has turned away from voting, which I will explain in a minute why, to this more inclusive and collaborative approach, which aims to reaching consensus. It's now embraced by the entire UN system, and my research has led me to see that the very beginnings of the consensus approach can be traced back to the early 1950s. So it's something which has been evolving over a long period of time. And as I mentioned before, it's based upon this UN4MUN, which was first developed by the UN Department of Public Information in 2009 when I was a part of that process. Now, there are some major differences between Wyman and other model UNs. The first major difference is that model UNs around the world use what are called parliamentary rules of procedure, whereas the UN uses real UN procedures that are different for every UN entity. So in traditional model UNs around the world, they follow these parliamentary rules of procedure, which have a lot of motions and points, which are used in parliaments. And the UN is not a parliament, so it's actually inappropriate to be using parliamentary rules of procedure with an institution that is a parliament, and even more so, some of these parliamentary rules violate what's called the principle of sovereign equality, which the UN was founded upon. The reason why this evolved this way is actually the model UN simulations were built upon and grew out of early simulations of the League of Nations, which I've traced back to the early 1920s. So students in high school and universities and colleges started simulating the League of Nations very early after it came into existence. And then this eventually morphed into simulations of the United Nations. And so parliamentary rules of procedure had already been used in simulations of the League of Nations, and so they were just carried over into simulations of the United Nations without stopping and asking whether or not this was appropriate or not. So Wyman does not at all use parliamentary rules of procedure. Every entity is different. Model UNs use the same parliamentary rules of procedure with every UN entity that they are simulating, and they do not differentiate or even acknowledge that different UN entities function differently. So our simulations are based upon my thorough study of each institution and how it functions, and reflects very accurately how real diplomats in each of these bodies actually negotiate. The other big difference is that model UNs around the world make all of their decisions by voting. Although the UN, when it was created, in the charter makes it clear that decisions will be made by a majority vote. The UN started moving away from voting in the early 1950s, and today the majority of decisions made throughout the UN system are made without taking a vote at all. And I'll explain a little bit more about that throughout my talk. How is it possible that 193 countries can reach a decision on a resolution without taking a vote? It seems almost an impossible task, but that's what happens in the majority of cases in the UN today. It is a much more inclusive process, much more collaborative, and it really captures the spirit of the UN today. Now I want to turn our attention a little bit to the conference that's coming up, our fall online conference, which will be starting the very end of October. Normally, we would have had a live face-to-face conference in Geneva at that time, but because of the COVID pandemic, we've had to move this conference online. And the structure of it will be something very different, because normally our face-to-face conference would take place over 4 days, very intensive, from morning through evening. And now that we are moving online, it gives us more flexibility to leverage technology so that we've actually spread it out over a period of 10 days. So the simulation of different UN entities will be spread out over 2 weekends. The first weekend will be the Saturday and Sunday, October 31st and November 1st. And then that will finish up the following weekend on the 7th and 8th of November. During the week intervening between the 2 weekends, from November 2nd to November 6th, we will have many different side events, and I'll go over those in a moment, at different times during the day to give the delegates participating in the conference many different choices that they can participate in. The simulations on the weekends are mandatory. All the participants must participate in the simulations on the weekends. However, participation in the side events during the week are optional and voluntary. What will happen during the simulations? How will they be organized? Well, over 4 days, there will be a total of 15 hours of simulation. On the first day, which will be on the 31st of October, we'll have training sessions with the students, going over the rules of procedure and other important information that they need to know before they actually begin the simulation. Then when the actual simulation starts, one of the first things that will happen is there'll be an interactive session with a UN staff member or other expert on the agenda item that they will be discussing throughout the conference. Every student will be assigned a topic and a UN entity that they will be participating in, and a country that they will be representing. And those assignments will be sent in advance of the conference so that the students can start preparing their knowledge of the issue and researching what their country's position is so that they can accurately represent their country's position during the negotiations. After an interactive session with a UN member or expert on the agenda item, then they will move into informal consultations, where they will begin by, I'm sorry, let me just fix this slide. So on day 2, they will draft a resolution, and then they will begin merging their resolutions. So in every simulation, we divide the students up into 4 or 5 groups. Each group drafts their own version of the resolution on a particular topic. Then they come together, we merge all of their resolutions until there is only one text to negotiate. Once we have one text to negotiate, then they begin what's called the line-by-line review. This is what actually goes on behind the scenes during informal consultations, where real diplomats go paragraph by paragraph and they begin proposing amendments or changes to the text for other members of that UN body to consider. After all of the amendments have been included in the text, we call that a compilation text. A compilation text is a text where all of the amendments have been inserted into a document that will be negotiated. Then on day 3, after they finish the line-by-line review, they will begin the debate of amendments, where they will go amendment by amendment and negotiate whether to keep that amendment and make it a part of the resolution, or whether that amendment should be withdrawn or retracted. Or what often happens during negotiations, they agree on an alternate wording of the amendment that everyone agrees to, and then that amendment is made a part of the text. They do that until there are no amendments left to negotiate. That the wrap-up of the debate goes on to day 4, and then once they have reached consensus, then we convene a final formal meeting to adopt the resolution. So you can see that over the course of the 4 days, most of their time is spent in informal consultations where there are no rules of procedure. The only rules of procedure that come into play are during the initial formal meeting, during the general debate where they make statements, and then during the final formal meeting where they adopt the resolution. So to give you some idea of the side events, that this would take place during the 2 weekends. We will have different UN speakers on different topics, some related to the topics that will be debated during the weekend, and some on other UN topics. We are now, for instance, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN, so I am inviting some UN speakers and scholars to talk about general issues related to the UN and its future. We will have skill building workshops for students, some of them focusing on developing their skills for Model UN conferences, some of them dealing with developing their skills for applying to colleges or interviews for jobs, that kind of skill building. We will have different workshops for teachers. We will have online social events. We will have workshops on international careers. So for instance, I'm inviting the Office of Human Rights and Management to talk to students about how students can apply for jobs if they're interested in working at the UN, or how they can apply for internships. We will have a college fair where we'll be inviting different universities around the world to present to students what kind of program their institution offers, and more to come. So this will be throughout that week from the 2nd to the 6th of November, and there will be many opportunities for students to participate in these side events, and it is all optional for them, so they can participate in as many as they wish, or in those that are the most convenient for them given the time zone that they are in. What makes Wyman Online different? One is that we offer live interactions with UN staff or experts on a particular agenda item, and that because of our close association with the UN, we're able to offer these interactions with real UN staff and experts. We offer training and Q&A at the beginning of the simulation that teaches students the real procedures followed at the UN. It brings an accurate simulation of how the UN functions online by teaching about the consensus building process that students can learn about from the comfort and safety of their home. Because we are in this COVID-19 health emergency, and it is not possible for us to have a face-to-face conference, students can participate in this from the safety of their home, and there's no worry about the health risks. We also offer extensive training materials and other online resources to help participants prepare that include handbooks which detail the history, flow of debate, terms used, and instructions on how to submit amendments during the conference. We give them background documents on each agenda item. We give them links to documents published by the UN on the agenda item, and links to statements made by ambassadors students are representing, or political groups that their countries belong to. So there's a lot of work that goes on that we do in preparation for these conferences to help students be properly informed when they participate in these conferences, and that makes us unique. Another important difference is all agenda items come from the actual UN agenda so that students can find ample resources to prepare for the online simulation. Many UN conferences around the world choose items that aren't actually on the UN agenda. And so when they go to find information, they often have difficulty finding that because these agenda items don't exist on the UN agenda. And so when I was the focal point for Model UN at the UN, I would often get frantic messages or telephone calls from students who were saying that they were preparing for a conference, but they couldn't find any information on the topic that they will be debating. And this was often the reason why. So we make sure that we only choose topics that we know students will be able to find ample resources about from the UN. The other thing is we are very careful about which countries we assign. So we do a lot of research ahead of time to make sure that we assign countries that are actively involved on the agenda item and that have made statements at the UN that students could actually find, or if there are no statements by the country that they are representing, at least we make sure that they can find statements by a political group that their country belongs to. So either they'll be able to find a statement by their country, by real ambassadors who spoke at the UN on that agenda item, or they'll find statements made by the chair of a political group that their country belongs to. So this is a part of the work that we do behind the scenes to make sure that students have ample resources so that when they are going to the conference, they can accurately represent during the negotiations what their country position is on a particular issue. Because we spend so much time in informal consultations and not informal meetings, the students have a lot of opportunity to speak and develop their negotiation skills. And because it is online, we will offer breakout rooms that will allow students to caucus in smaller groups or to focus on a particular group of amendments to move delegates towards consensus. So students will be meeting, for the most part, we will be using Zoom as the platform. Students will be meeting in one meeting room much of the time, but then they will be breaking out into smaller rooms as they need to during informal consultations to have small group discussions or to work on particular amendments to help move the group towards consensus. One of the things that will be unique about our simulation is we will attempt the first ever online simulation of what's called the Committee of the Whole as a part of our simulation of the CCPCJ, which is a functional commission of Ecosoc. CCPCJ stands for the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. And we will be working with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, which serves as the secretariat for this functional commission in the UN. So that will be something that will be unique. So that's the general overview. Just to emphasize some of the points, if you have done Model UN and you are coaches and you've been to other conferences, all of the motions and points that you are used to using, points of inquiry, points of information, points of personal privilege, motions for moderated and unmoderated caucuses, motions to second, all of those do not exist at the United Nations. They are only used in parliamentary context. There is only one point of order, which is the same at the UN and which is used in parliamentary rules, and that is a point of order. That is the only point which exists at the UN. All of the other points do not exist. And so actually this frees up the students from having to focus on making lots of motions and points to actually focus concretely on the discussion and the negotiation of the text of a resolution. So there's a radical difference between the simulations that we organize and the simulations of other Model UNs, which heavily rely upon motions and points that do not exist at the real UN. So as I said, if you were to experience one of our conferences, you would see it's much more based upon a free-flowing discussion and negotiation without these interruptions of points and motions. And it gives students many opportunities to intervene and to make arguments and to move and collaborate with other delegates to reach consensus, to reach agreement. Traditional model UNs, because they make all of their decisions by voting and because of all these points and motions, tend to be very competitive. And they try to make sure that their resolution gets accepted over somebody else's resolution. Our focus on consensus leads the delegates to work together, to collaborate, to find common ground. And so the spirit of our conferences are much more collaborative because students are working together to find a common solution to a problem. So that is also a major difference between what we are trying to accomplish, which is closer to the UN, and what traditional model UN tries to accomplish, which is more competitive. Every simulation of every UN body is slightly different. So for instance, in the General Assembly today, even though the UN in its charter states that decisions will be made by a simple majority, the General Assembly has moved away from voting so that today roughly 75% of their decisions, there are over 300 resolutions that are adopted every year in the General Assembly, roughly 75% of over 300 resolutions are adopted without a vote. Same thing in the Human Rights Council. Roughly 75% of their resolutions are adopted without a vote. In 25% of the cases in both the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, which is a subsidiary body to the General Assembly, in roughly 25% of the cases where they are not able to reach consensus, they do take action by taking a vote. But that is only after they've put their best efforts to trying to reach consensus. In the Economic and Social Council, otherwise known as Ecosoc, in most of the functional commissions of Ecosoc, they never vote at all. Most of their decisions are made by consensus, and if they are not able to reach consensus in Ecosoc, no decision is taken. So the resolution that they are negotiating is withdrawn if they are not able to reach consensus. So it's a very different process in Ecosoc. Security Council relies heavily on consensus as well. There are certain documents, such as a presidential statement or press elements, and so forth, that if the Council does not reach consensus on those documents are not adopted at all by the Security Council. What's unique in the Security Council is the Security Council never formally adopted its rules of procedure. They use what are called provisional rules of procedure. And although it is not written in the provisional rules of procedure, the Security Council has a practice of always voting on their resolutions, regardless of whether there is complete agreement. It's interesting that between 80 and 90% of the resolutions of the Security Council are adopted by a 15-0 vote, which means all of the council members are in agreement on the text of a resolution in the Security Council in the majority of cases. Yet it is their practice that even though consensus has been reached, they always vote on their resolutions. So every UN body is different. I can continue and give a whole lecture on what some of the differences are between the bodies. But be that as it may, I just want to make the point that consensus is widely adopted throughout the UN system, but there are these individual differences between UN bodies. And in our simulations, we include each of the rules of procedure that is specific to each UN body, whereas in model UNs around the world, they use the same rules of procedure, those parliamentary rules of procedure, with each UN entity, no matter what it is they're simulating. And so that is really not very accurate, and students do not really learn about the differences between these UN bodies, nor do they learn about the consensus process. So I'm going to stop here just briefly to give you an opportunity to ask any questions about the Weinman approach or the differences between Weinman and traditional model UN, any questions you may have about the differences in the rules of procedure. And then after answering some of your questions, then I will switch and focus on a historical overview of how this consensus process has evolved, why the UN has turned away from voting, so that you have a better understanding about why the UN makes its decisions different today than it did when the UN was created in 1945. It's very important to me that when we do our simulations, that students understand not only, I don't want students to simulate the UN in the most accurate way possible just so that they know that this is an accurate simulation. I want them to know the reasons why the UN follows these rules of procedure and that they are different from how the UN started in 1945 and why they have made these changes. So I will stop here, Edgardo, for any questions, and then we will continue with the rest of the talk after I answer questions about anything I've talked about up to now.
Yes, we have a question from John. He is asking, the social aspect for student participants during MUN is important. What kind of ideas are in mind for social events during the event?
Thank you for that. I will tell you we're still working on some of those ideas, and we're soliciting suggestions from anyone. So if you have any suggestions, we would be open to that. But one of our popular social events is something we call the Global Experience. And this is where we give students an opportunity during the conference for them to present their culture or their country, something about their country to other students. So during the global experience, it allows students to dress up in the dress of their countries, to present customs and food or any information that they want about their country. Sometimes during the global experience, students will organize, different kinds of dances that represent the folklore of their country and so forth. So we're working on how can we bring this global experience online so that we can have different breakout rooms, for instance, where you can go to a group of students from Turkey or a group of students from Uruguay or whatever, and they will have an opportunity to present their culture or something about their culture to students, and students can move from room to room to learn about the different cultures that are represented and participating in the conference. So that's one example of our global experience of a social event. We are also working on other ideas, and as I said, if you have any ideas, we're thinking of having different kinds of competitions, having different quizzes where we test students' knowledge about the UN and so forth, and maybe having some prizes for students that do the best. Those are some examples. Mariah, who is my colleague who's on the call, if you had anything you wanted to add further. But as I said, we're open to any suggestions, but that's an example, a few examples of the kind of social events we're thinking about.
Well, sorry, I need to turn my...
We can hear you.
Turn off, sorry. So Bill did a really good job of talking about our social events, but something that we're doing very different in our fall online conference is we're expanding these events not to just be a social dynamic, but a professional developing dynamic. I don't want to bring out details yet because we will be sharing this on our social media, making some really big announcements. We're finalizing a couple of things before we do that. But yeah, this is going to be more dynamic than ever. It's not just a chance to meet people around the world. It's also a chance to develop your skills, because that's the thing. Model UNs aren't just about going there and doing the process and familiarizing yourself with the UN. It's also about developing skills such as public speaking, negotiations, and we want to highlight that in our events. So that's another great opportunity if you join our fall online conference, is that you will also get some professional development, side work as well, and opportunities to do that. Things that will be announced on our social media, so make sure you're following along, and that's pretty much all I have to say about those details.
I have another question, Bill. The question is...
An email that they could... Yeah.
The question is, you have in mind students participating from home? We hope to be operating school as normal and to have our participants all in the same place. Does that give you a technical headaches?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again?
Yes, sorry, because of my son that is here.
It's okay.
If one school is, the school from Istanbul International School is saying that They are hoping to be operating the school as normal. And if all participants are in the same place, if that is a technical headache for you.
No, not at all. So you have that option, and we want the teachers and faculty advisors to be involved as possible in helping students prepare for the conference. And so that's why we're also having workshops for teachers and helping them prepare their students for the conference as well. But no, it is not a problem. So during our side events, which will happen during the week, we will be having a schedule in different time zones, and you are more than welcome to participate as an entire class in any of these side events that we have. There are no restrictions at all. On the weekend, of course, it's a little different. It's up to you. If you wanted students to come to school during the weekend, during their participation, that's a choice that you have, but just keep in mind that students will be participating in different simulations, so you will not have, one class necessarily participating in the same simulation. And the reason why we do that is we want students to mix with other students from other countries and other schools and provide a more diverse experience for them. But if during the week you want to participate in any of the events that we will have spread out throughout the week as an entire class, of course, that's permissible.
To add to that, we've actually been talking to some schools about this, about the idea of them kind of working on it together in their school. Taiwan has not really been impacted as heavily by COVID, so their school schedule is looking like it's going to go back as normal. And the teachers were discussing doing it with each other in a room where they can assist their students. So it's definitely something that we know is viable. We also think could be very helpful because some of these students, it might be their first time working in Model UN or with the Weinman format, and it's a very great support to have. So it's not a headache for us, and in fact, I think it makes the experience all better when you have a little bit of support behind you.
Okay, I have a question. Do you, by any chance, have games, role plays aimed to develop student skills in achieving consensus? It will be very helpful for us when we help our students to get ready for the conference.
Well, I just wanted to finish up on the last question, but it does lead very well into this question as well. Prior to the conference itself, we will be doing a series of webinars. And again, we can schedule these during a time when the students are in school so that you could do this together as a class. But we will be having webinars on every UN body that will be simulated. So if your students are participating in the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly or the World Health Assembly, we will be having individual webinars on each of the UN entities that will be simulated. In addition to that, I do have a separate training which I've developed on teaching what consensus is about. And I could absolutely organize that as a webinar prior to the conference, which teaches students very concretely what consensus is about without going through a formal simulation of the UN. So yes, I have an activity, a role-playing activity that I have developed specifically to teach students about consensus that is more concrete, a more concrete introduction to what it is.
Yes, I have another question. How will you manage participation from different time zones?
So we will be organizing 2 different time zones. One time zone will be geared towards the Asia Pacific and Europe schools, and then we will have a second time zone which will be more accessible for the Americas and Europe. So Europe will be sort of have an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to join the Asia Pacific group or whether they want to join the Americas group. So I don't have the schedule will very clearly define these 2 time zones that you will be able to choose from. So we're doing this in order to make this as accessible as possible to people in different time zones. So there'll be 2 different time zones that we will have that hopefully will be accessible. If you're in Europe, you will have a choice. If you're in the Americas, there will be one time zone that will be easier for you to participate in, and Asian Pacific will have a second time zone.
For the moment, no more questions, Bill.
Add to that as well. So also managing participation, aside from just having the 2 time zones, we do have it where the weekend where the simulations take part are mandatory, and then those middle side events are optional. We want you to be involved as much as you want, but it's important for everybody to be in the simulations because it impacts other people's experience. We want to hear the voices from countries that are being represented. So it's important that they're there in the simulation. So we do instill that that is mandatory, but the side events is optional. But we highly encourage you partake because they're going to be amazing.
I have a last question before we continue that I think it's important. Will we be given the different rules of procedure for each body?
Yes, that is a part of the training, the webinars that I mentioned. Each webinar, we have a handbook that I've written for every simulation, which goes over the history of that body and also the rules of procedure that will be followed for that specific UN body. And in addition to the handbook, we will have webinars where I will train students, where they will have an opportunity to ask questions and interact with me. And so they will have ample opportunity to learn about those rules of procedure through the handbook and through a live webinar that I will schedule.
And I will tell you personally, Bill is phenomenal at teaching people this. I actually learned back in February in a crash course really quick, and he made it such a simple process. It was so easy to pick up. For me, I competed on a very different format when I was in college at MUNS. So I had to learn a whole new format and the whole new procedures, and he just made it seamless. It's a very great process. It's easy to pick up. And also, I do think our process is a stronger process for our students. I think they get a lot more value out of it and a lot more development from it.
I have another question, Bill. How do you see the role of the teachers during the conference? In Geneva, we are happy to visit the committees, but now the environment is totally different.
Teachers can join the conference. There's for a fee of $50 per teacher, they can join and observe any of the simulations that are going on that their students are a part of. They can also participate with their students in any of the side events. So yes, they're welcome to participate in that way. We would like the teachers to be involved as much as possible with their students in making sure that they are preparing properly for the conference and helping them with their research to make sure that they are looking up the resources that we're providing to them to learn about the topic that they've been assigned, that they've been reading statements by the ambassadors, real ambassadors of the country they're representing or political groups that their countries belong to, so that they are familiar with what their country's position. They will be writing position papers that they will have to submit, and so helping them put together those position papers. So your oversight and your supervision, I think, as teachers is very important. So we would like you to be involved. Another thing I just want to mention in terms of the way we're organizing the simulations on the weekend. So basically, there'll be 15 hours of simulation over the 2 weekends, which comes out to roughly 4 hours a day. And then at the end, we will have, on the last day, we'll have a closing ceremony for all of the participants and a keynote speaker for our closing plenary, just as we do for our opening ceremony. So it's important to keep in mind that there will be breaks during the day. In other words, it will not be a straight 4 hours. We will be probably separating it up into 2-hour blocks. So on a Saturday, there'll be one block of 2 hours, then there'll be a break, and then they'll come back again for another 2 hours. Then on Sunday, again, it will be broken up into 2 blocks. Same thing the following weekend, because we know from our experience of doing online simulations that if you go on too long, it becomes too much for students to keep focused and concentrated online for that period of time. So I wanted you to know that we will be breaking up the simulation over the weekend into smaller blocks of time with a break in between.
I have a last question. Will you offer a previous training on position papers and resolution writing?
Yes, so this is something during our webinar with students. a part of my webinar training is to go over the position paper and how to write a good position paper.
Great.
I'd like to add something
No
real
more
quick about the last question. Bill did mention that teachers could join for $50. It is also important to note that if you join as a delegation, which most teachers would be bringing a group of students, so that's how you would join, you have a $50 tacked on, but it also is split between not only your first teacher is included in that, but you also then enter the awards as a delegation. So not only like individual awards, you now have another pool of awards you can receive, but you do get a teacher included in your delegation fee. So you do get one teacher that can join in.
I just need to interrupt you. That's a separate fee that we're dealing with directly with the ISA. The teachers don't have to worry about that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Apologies. My confusion.
It's okay. No problem.
That's all I have.
So no more questions. You can continue, Bill.
Okay, so now I'm going to give you a historical overview. Just give me 1 second to change my slides. Okay, so now my focus, now that you have a general idea of what Wyman is about, and you have a general idea that we will be focusing on consensus and teaching students what the consensus process is and how it works. Now I just want to give you a basic understanding of what do we mean by consensus, how did it evolve, and why do we find today that the UN has moved away from voting and embraces the consensus process throughout the UN system. So again, my objective is to help you better understand how the consensus process evolved and better understand why consensus decisions are now preferred. So here's a simple timeline to give you an idea. The very first international conference dates back to 1864. It was a conference that took place in Geneva, and the focus of it was how to improve care for wounded soldiers. And at that time, they adopted something which I refer to as the absolute unanimity rule, so that this was one of the very first international organizations. And so governments would only participate in an international organization because if they were sure that no decision could be imposed upon them that they did not agree with. So from the very beginning, international organizations would only form if they followed the unanimity rule, which meant that if there was one government that disagreed with a decision that was being proposed, no decision would be taken. And governments would only join international organizations if their sovereign rights were protected by the unanimity rule. So if we fast forward to 1919, when the League of Nations came into effect after World War I, they continued following the unanimity rule for what we call substantive decisions, but then they broke away from the unanimity rule and applied the majority rule for procedural decisions. I'll come back to that in a second. And then we find in 1945, when the UN was created, it completely rejected the unanimity rule and instead adopted the majority rule, which was formalized in the Charter of the United Nations. So what we find between 1864 and 1945, we find that international organizations, although they started out with following the unanimity rule because it protected their sovereign rights, we see that over time, they gradually rejected the unanimity rule until we reached 1945, where the unanimity rule was completely rejected. One of the reasons for that, and there are a number of reasons, but one of the reasons happened because as intergovernmental organizations began to form more and more countries began to be members of international organizations, it became harder and harder for decisions to be made because the unanimity rule would allow one country to block a decision if it did not agree with that decision. And so it made it harder and harder for international organizations to make decisions the larger that they became. So it was interesting in the League of Nations, for instance, that we found that they continued using the unanimity rule, let's say in the Council of the League of Nations, if they had to make a decision about how to address a conflict between two countries, they continued using the unanimity rule to make what are called substantive decisions. Those are decisions dealing with how to address a particular conflict. But if it was a procedural decision, such as they were going to have a meeting and they had to make a decision on what the agenda of the meeting was going to be, then they moved away from using the unanimity rule to the majority rule, and they allowed basic procedural decisions to be decided by a simple majority of members of the League of Nations. So cracks started to form in the League of Nations, and those cracks got bigger and bigger until the League of Nations and the unanimity rule was completely eliminated. So decisions in 1945, according to the UN Charter, were made by the majority rule, which was a simple majority. It is the case that there is a small group of decisions in the UN Charter which are referred to as important questions, which require a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly in order to be made. I'm not going to go into much detail about those, but just be aware of the fact that the majority of decisions according to the UN Charter only require a simple majority. That means 51% of the members of the Council of the United Nations. But there are a small group of questions referred to as important questions that require a 2/3 majority. An example of that would be if the General Assembly wanted to adopt a resolution reforming the Security Council, a resolution that deals with reforming the Security Council would require a 2/3 vote in order for that decision to be adopted. What we find in the United Nations is that by the mid-1950s, I found evidence that the UN started to move in the Economic Commission of Europe. We find evidence that they started to move away from making decisions by consensus, by voting, towards making decisions by consensus. And then if we fast forward to 1971, we find in a GA resolution, a resolution which encouraged all resolutions adopted by the General Assembly to be adopted by consensus. That means without a vote. And in 1975, we find for the first time, I analyzed all of the decisions made in the General Assembly from its creation until today, and I'll show you some of the results of that analysis. But in 1975, I found that that was the first year when the majority of decisions made by the General Assembly were made without taking a vote. And then fast forward to 2020, we find that consensus is now preferred throughout the UN system. So we find this evolution beginning in 1864 with the unanimity rule. International organizations gradually moved away from the unanimity rule towards making decisions by a majority vote. And then after the UN was created, they eventually gradually moved away from making decisions by a majority vote towards making decisions without voting at all. And the question really becomes that I want to focus on now is why did the UN move away from making decisions by voting? This is just a brief, I'm not going to go into too much information about this, but this is a brief history about the unanimity rule, which is a separate lecture in its own. But this is just, for instance, in the Hague Peace Conference in 1899, we find the president of the Hague Peace Conference, he gave a very good definition of why the unanimity rule was the basis for making decisions at that time. The first principle of any conference is unanimity. Each delegation represents a different state. equally sovereign and has no right to accept a decision of the majority contrary to the will of its government. So again, governments, the starting point of governments was the fact that they were sovereign nations and they did not want to be a part of any organization where other governments could impose decisions upon them that they did not agree with. And as I said before, in 1907, we find that these international conferences got larger and larger, and so it was harder for these organizations to adhere to absolute unanimity because it became harder to make decisions. And the Unanimity Rule was inserted in the Covenant of the League of Nations, and we find that certain exceptions were made in the League of Nations to the Unanimity Rule. For instance, new members could be admitted by a 2/3 vote, did not require a unanimous vote. Approval of permanent and non-permanent members only required a simple majority, and the appointment of a Secretary General of the League of Nations only required a majority. Now, we found in 1924 in the League of Nations, they put together a committee of experts to make recommendations on whether changes should be made to the decision process followed by the League of Nations. And they made some decisions which are actually quite interesting because they actually, once we talk about in a minute the evolution of the decision-making process in the UN, we find that these recommendations in 1924 actually were embraced by the United Nations after 1945. So again, these were only recommendations made to the League of Nations, but they were really not implemented until the UN came into existence. So one of the things they recommended is that decisions should be unanimous and every effort should be made to attain this result. But if unanimity is impossible, the majority should not be prevented from reaching consent by the mere opposition of the minority. So again, if we look at how the General Assembly functions today, this is very much following the recommendations of these experts in 1924. The General Assembly starts out from the position of trying to their goal is to reach agreement on the text of a resolution. But if they find that they cannot reach consensus on a draft resolution, then they do allow the decision to be made by a simple majority so that the majority is not prevented from reaching consent by the mere opposition of the minority. I do want to recall, however, in Ecosoc, for instance, they follow a different decision-making process. In most cases, there is one exception to this that I found in Ecosoc where they do allow decisions to be made by voting if consensus cannot be reached. But in the majority of the functional commissions of Ecosoc, if agreement cannot be reached on the text of a resolution, that resolution is withdrawn and no action is taken. One of the other recommendations, and this is quite interesting, is this recommendation that they recommended allowing members of the Council of the League of Nations to be able to sign on to a treaty, but then to deposit what are called reservations, which would stipulate parts of the treaty that their government did not agree with. So they wanted to give countries the ability to participate in the decision-making process, but also have some mechanism for stating that there are parts of a treaty, of a formal treaty that might be legally binding, offer them an opportunity to opt out of specific parts of a treaty in the form of by depositing reservations on that. And that is a system that we follow today in the United Nations. So if there is some treaty, legal treaty, which is being negotiated in the United Nations, countries can become signatories to the treaty. In other words, they can actually sign the treaty and then submit it to ratification in their legislatures. But they can also deposit reservations with the Secretary General where it says, in this clause of this treaty, our government does not agree with what is in this clause, and we will not be following or implementing that clause. So this allows them to sign on to a legal treaty, but then make it clear that certain parts of the treaty they will not follow. And this has had an impact also on resolutions, on the adoption of resolutions that are the part of the United Nations. So, for instance, in the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Council allows delegations to adopt a resolution by consensus, in other words, without submitting it to a vote, but in the final formal meeting of the resolution, governments can take the floor to say, you know, we've agreed to adopt this resolution by consensus and not put it to a vote, but we want to make it clear to the council that in operative paragraph 3, our government will disassociate itself from that particular paragraph. So this is very similar to the practice which is allowed for formal treaties which are legally binding, and apply it to resolutions which are not legally binding, but it allows governments to feel comfortable adopting resolutions without putting it to a vote because they can then disassociate from individual paragraphs of the resolution. We find also in the Security Council, in what are called presidential statements, which have a different status as resolutions. Presidential statements are only adopted by consensus. But in the Security Council, at one point, they started allowing governments to disassociate, to adopt presidential statements by consensus, but they could also at the same time disassociate their governments from individual paragraphs in the presidential statement and take the floor during the formal adoption of the presidential statement, where they say, yes, we've agreed to adopt this presidential statement by consensus, but at the same time we disassociate ourselves from this particular paragraph in the presidential statement. So it's interesting how these recommendations that were made by a committee of experts in the League of Nations have found their way into the practices of the United Nations today. And I can say, quite frankly, that if governments did not have this ability to disassociate from individual paragraphs, there would probably be far less consensus reached on individual resolutions. Another place where we see this important recommendation implemented is in the following way. A government in the General Assembly can agree to adopt a resolution by consensus, and yet during the final formal meeting they can take the floor again to say that we have agreed to adopt this without putting it to a vote, but we also want to put on the record that our government is unhappy that in this particular part of the resolution that some language was taken out that we thought should be there, and we hope that in the future this language will be added into the resolution. So that's another form where governments can agree to something. In other words, the agreement is not unanimous, so there's a difference between unanimity and consensus. Unanimity would mean that a government is in agreement with everything. Consensus allows governments to agree to adopt resolutions without putting it to a vote, but it also gives them certain safety valves where they can say and make it a part of the public record to say that there are parts of a resolution that they are not happy with or parts of a resolution that they disassociate from. So this is very important to understand the differences between unanimity and consensus. They are not the same thing. Consensus offers more flexibility. Unanimity is more restrictive, because in unanimity, you have to agree with everything that is in the text, whether it's a treaty or a resolution. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So as I said, when the United Nations was created, the rule of absolute unanimity was discarded, and instead they proposed this majority rule. So if we look at the General Assembly, which is the largest intergovernmental body, it's the only body in the United Nations which includes all 193 member states. And they work according to the majority rule, which means that every member state has one vote regardless of how big or small. And this is based upon the principle of sovereign equality. So no matter how powerful your government is, no matter how big your military is, no matter how rich or poor you are, every government is treated equally and every government has one vote. And when a vote is taken, those votes are not weighted. In other words, the most powerful countries in the world are not given more of a vote than the weakest or poorest countries in the world. They're all treated equally. Now, if we go to the UN Charter, it states very clearly that the General Assembly can only make recommendations. That means that their decisions cannot be enforced. Their decisions cannot be imposed. That means whatever decisions are taken in a resolution, in a GA resolution, it is completely up to each government to decide if they will implement any of the actions recommended in the resolution or not. The same thing goes for Ecosoc. See if I don't have that here. But Ecosoc, for instance, if you read the UN Charter, it makes it very clear that the decisions of Ecosoc are nothing more than recommendations. So the question becomes, why did the UN strip the General Assembly, Ecosoc, Human Rights Council, and other UN bodies of the ability to make their decisions legally binding and leave it completely up to governments to decide what they want to implement or not? That would seem to weaken the UN institution if you completely leave it up to every government to decide what they want to follow or not. This has had an important impact on why the UN has moved away from voting to consensus. And I'll explain to you why this has happened. Imagine that I am the representative of a government and we have drafted a resolution for the General Assembly to consider. And I submit my draft of my resolution. I might have done this in conjunction with a few other governments. So as a group, let's say as a group, we submit a resolution to the General Assembly to consider on one of the agenda items on the UN's agenda. Now, according to the UN Charter, all we need is a simple majority of countries to agree with our resolution in order for it to be adopted, and then we can move on to another resolution and submit that to a vote as long as it has a simple majority, and then keep going until we've finished with all the resolutions. If I'm the sponsor of a resolution, I only need a simple majority. So I can ignore 49% of the council because I only need 51% of the countries to agree with my resolution to have it adopted. But in making decisions in that matter, I risk alienating 49% of the governments that are members of the United Nations if I ignore them and don't include them in the negotiation process, and where the perspectives and positions of their country are not reflected anywhere in the resolution. So you can see that the voting process lowers the probability that other governments will implement recommended actions because there's no way of enforcing those recommendations. And so if, as an institution, the UN wants to have the greatest impact in making the world a more peaceful place, then it has had to face this decision-making process and find ways to strengthen the decision-making process to increase the probability that more governments will actually implement the actions that are recommended. And so by moving away from voting to this consensus process, That is how it has strengthened the probability that its recommendations will be followed by more countries. So what is this negotiation process that we refer to as consensus? So again, let's go back to the beginning of the process. My government, along with other governments, have drafted a resolution that we submit to, let's say, the General Assembly for consideration. If my goal is to reach consensus, then my government, along with the other governments that are sponsoring that resolution, have to negotiate with every government that is a member of the United Nations. That means we have to spend more time talking to every government, listening to their positions, seeing if there are any changes they wish to make to our resolution, seeing which changes we feel comfortable agreeing to, or perhaps finding a middle ground where we make some compromises that we can all agree to, so we can finally reach a draft of a resolution where everyone feels that they've been included in the negotiation process, and everyone feels that their point of view has been heard and is reflected in the final text of the resolution, so that when that point is reached, where everyone has reached agreement on the text, there is no need to submit it to a vote. And governments also know that if there are parts of a resolution that they don't completely agree to, but that they don't have strong objections to, they can, in the final formal meeting, make it clear as a part of the public record of the General Assembly which part of the resolution their government is not happy with. This process is longer, takes more time than the voting process, because as sponsors, we have to negotiate with all the governments. We have to really listen better. We have to understand different positions, and we need to be willing to make compromises. But what we get for that is we get a resolution where the probability is much higher that governments will follow most, if not all, of the actions that are recommended in the resolutions that are adopted. Much, much more so than if we had adopted that resolution by voting. Now again, there are some resolutions in the General Assembly which, even though governments start with the hope that they will reach consensus, sometimes there is a point during the negotiation process where they realize they've gone as far as they can, and the only way to take action on the resolution is to submit it to a vote. But I will tell you that my analysis of votes that have been taken have shown that when votes are taken, most of those resolutions are adopted by 2/3 or more of the members of a committee that is negotiating. So you still see the impact of a negotiation process which aims to reach consensus even when votes are taken. If you look at the history of the United Nations, when the consensus approach was not very strong and votes were taken, you find a much smaller majority adopting those resolutions. And I think that this shows quite clearly that even when votes are taken, the consensus process still has an impact on the final vote, because we find a higher number of countries voting in favor of the resolution. I spoke about the fact that the Security Council, and the Security Council, understanding the Security Council will help us understand why the UN made the decision to strip the General Assembly, Ecosoc, the Human Rights Council, and other UN bodies of the power to make its decisions legally binding. And the reason for that is very much involved in the Security Council and its role and the authorities granted to it in the UN Charter. So here's what we find. Security Council is the only body that the UN Charter authorizes to make its decisions legally binding. Now, remember that it authorizes the Security Council the right to make its decisions legally binding, but the Security Council is not obligated to do so. In other words, it can decide to make a decision legally binding or not. So it doesn't mean that every decision by the Security Council is legally binding, But unlike the General Assembly, or unlike Ecosoc, or unlike the Human Rights Council, it has the power, it is authorized by the Charter to make its decisions legally binding, and the UN Charter also authorizes it to enforce its decisions. So, again, the UN Charter is very careful about enforcement. If you look at the different charters of the UN, you will see that it's very clear that the first step taken by the Security Council is try to mediate conflicts peacefully. If it is unable to do so, it can then go a step higher and impose sanctions, economic sanctions on countries that are violating the principles of the UN. And then it can go one step higher. As a last resort, it can enforce its decisions through the use of military force, if it decides to. Now, this is often a very controversial decision taken by the Security Council, and is often blocked when that decision is put up for discussion. But it has been the case that the Security Council has, on occasion, authorized its decisions to be enforced by the use of force. Now, remember, going back to where I began this discussion, when governments joined international organizations, they would only do so if they were protected from having those decisions imposed upon them. So in the Security Council, because decisions could be legally binding, the powers that were the victors of World War II, which at the time was the Soviet Union, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, they protected themselves, and China, I'm sorry, I left out China. They felt that they would only agree to the terms of the Security Council making their decision legally binding if they were given a veto power to protect themselves. They felt that they were the only ones that had the power to maintain international peace and security. That they were the only ones that had the military power to keep the world from war. And because of the great sacrifice they did, particularly the Soviet Union felt very strongly about this, because of the strong sacrifice they made, they did not want to put themselves in a position, in a new institution, where other governments, smaller governments, weaker governments, could impose decisions upon them. And they made it very clear that they would not agree to the formation of a new institution, which we now know as the United Nations. They would not agree to participate in this institution unless all of the members agreed to give them the veto power in the Security Council. Now, other countries were not happy about this, obviously, but they realized that we wouldn't have an intergovernmental organization to maintain peace and security in the world unless they agreed to the terms presented to them by the great powers or the victors of World War II. And so they agreed to go along with it. So if we look at the General Assembly, Ecosoc, Human Rights Council, and other UN bodies, what the great powers did is, by making their decisions only recommendations, by stripping them of the ability to make their decisions legally binding, there was no need for the veto power in any of the other UN bodies. And so they allowed decisions to be made by majority vote, because they knew that those decisions could not be imposed upon them as the great powers who won World War II. And so that is why we have a system today where we have many decisions that are made without enforcing them, and the great powers don't have a veto power in those decisions because they feel that those decisions cannot be imposed upon them. But those other bodies had an important thing to figure out. If they were making all these decisions that they would hope lead to a better world, they would want to make decisions that other governments would actually implement. But if they had no way of enforcing them, they found that they needed to change the decision-making process. They needed to make the decision-making process more inclusive and more collaborative. They needed to move towards a decision process that was not based upon voting, where a majority could outvote a minority, but they needed to move towards a decision-making process that was more collaborative, where every government felt that they were part of the decision-making process. And if language in a resolution was taken out because of compromises that were made, that the door was always open that somewhere down the road, language that was not accepted at one point might be added at another point in the negotiation process. And so that is why we have a process today that's moved away from voting, that's moved towards consensus. It all has to do with protections that the great powers inserted into the Charter of the UN to protect them from having smaller, weaker countries imposing decisions that they did not agree with. And so this is what we teach to students, this collaborative, inclusive process, where resolutions go through a review process where every government has the ability. So what happens is, once we have one text, one resolution for each of the simulations, that resolution is then submitted to a committee or to a council, and they go paragraph by paragraph. And every government has the opportunity to suggest changes to a resolution. And then each of those changes are submitted and debated, and compromises are made along the way until every amendment has been resolved and agreement has been reached whether to include the amendment as it was proposed, to withdraw the amendment that was proposed, or to agree to some compromise language that everyone can agree on. And once every amendment has been debated, and there are no further amendments, they go through the resolution one last time to make sure that there are no strong objections to the resolution. Then they go to a final formal meeting to adopt that, and during the final formal meeting, they still have an opportunity to say that there may be parts of the resolution that their governments are not in complete agreement, or that there are parts of the resolution that their governments want to disassociate from. And this is how the process works at the UN today. It is a process that is not understood in Model UN traditionally, which is more competitive and not collaborative. And they do not understand how diplomats from 193 countries work together to find common ground. But this is what we teach in our simulation, and students come away with a completely different understanding of what the UN is about. So we talked about the majority rule in the UA. We talked about how the consensus process first started to appear in 1955 in the Economic Commission for Europe. This is from the 1971 GA resolution that I talked about, where it states the special committee considers that the adoption of decisions and resolutions by consensus is desirable. Now remember, this GA resolution itself is only a recommendation because the GA had no way of enforcing this on other countries. So in 1971, it simply made a recommendation that decisions and resolutions should be made by consensus, that it was desirable. But the members of the council saw that if they shifted towards this consensus decision-making process, that they then raised the probability that more countries would actually implement the recommendations in each of these resolutions. So we find in 1979 until now, the majority of decisions by the GA are made by consensus. Now, this is what I was talking about, the analysis that I've made of all the resolutions that have been made over the history of the UN. So I collapsed all of the decisions made from 1946 to 1973. Remember, it was 1975, which was the watershed year, where we find a shift towards a majority of decisions made by consensus. So from 1946 to 1973, we find that 60%, over that time, 60% of the decisions that were made by taking a vote, and only 40% were made without voting, We have the resolution that comes in 1975 that encourages that all decisions making forward should be made by consensus. And so we find this shift very clear if we then look across 1974 to 2020. We now find across that time period that the majority of decisions were made without taking a vote. 70% of the decisions over those decades were made without voting, and now only 30% of the decisions during that time period were made by taking a vote. I will say that I found that the decisions made without voting peaked in 2005. In 2015, I found that roughly 90% of the decisions in 2015 were made without taking a vote. Today, that has decreased so that the percent of decisions made more recently in the General Assembly have decreased to roughly 75% without a vote. It's still the great majority of decisions, but the peak that was reached in 2015 has not been matched. And there are a lot of explanations for that. I mean, the political climate that we're in today, there's been a movement away from multilateralism, movements, more towards nationalism and that kind of thing. And I think that has impacted the decision-making process at the UN. But still, there is no getting around the fact that the consensus process is widely adopted throughout the UN system, and the great majority of the decisions today are still made without taking a vote. It's very interesting. So as I said, consensus increases the authority of decisions. It increases the likelihood that recommended actions will be implemented. This is just a small list of all the different UN bodies that now use consensus. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just want to make it clear that it's not just the UN, it's the UN system that now makes decisions without taking a vote. Consensus is not formalized in the rules of procedure, but it's encouraged. They can vote. Voting is allowed as a last resort when consensus is not reached. If consensus is not reached, then during the final formal meeting, individual members of the United Nations can put individual paragraphs or amendments to a vote before finally putting the entire resolution to a vote. That does not happen if consensus has been reached in informal consultations. Then there is no introduction of amendments or voting on individual paragraphs that takes place in the General Assembly. In the Human Rights Council, it's a little different. We find equal percentages, roughly 3/4, 75% of the resolutions in the Human Rights Council are adopted by consensus. However, even when consensus is reached in the informal consultations, the Human Rights Council allows amendments and votes on individual paragraphs during the final formal meeting, regardless of whether the resolution will be put to a vote or not. And member states in the Human Rights Council can disassociate from individual paragraphs or even the entire resolution, regardless of whether the resolution will be adopted by a vote or not. This does not occur. I have not seen this in other parts of the United Nations. And this is just to show that there are differences between the UN bodies in terms of how consensus works. We have something called the Vienna Consensus, which is not formalized. Voting rarely takes place in bodies that are based in Vienna. For instance, the Commission on Narcotics and Drugs have never voted, as have votes in the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. This is referred to as the spirit of Vienna, and I can tell you diplomats are very proud that the spirit of consensus is so strong in bodies that are based in Vienna. So most of the functional commissions of Ecosoc have never voted. If consensus is not reached, the resolution is withdrawn. I have only found one instance where voting does sometimes take place in Ecosoc. Security Council, as I said, consensus is required in the adoption of all documents except resolutions. Consensus is not reached, documents are not distributed, they're never voted on. Only documents that are always voted on are resolutions, and so forth. I've explained that to you. And just as a recap, consensus is generally understood to mean adoption of a decision without consensus. It does not mean that there is unanimity. There are numerous occasions when ambassadors state their reservations to some part of a resolution while not objecting to the resolution be adopted by consensus. It's like saying that, if imagine yourself having a pizza and with a group of people and having to agree on what you're going to put on your pizza. Consensus is like saying you've agreed to have things put on the pizza that you're not crazy about, but there's nothing on the pizza that you object to so strongly that you refuse to eat the pizza. This, by the way, this pizza activity is something that I created, and this is how I teach the consensus process to students so that they understand it in a very concrete way. And it makes it very easy for them to then understand how you move from making decisions about what you want to put on a pizza to then how you make decisions about what goes into a resolution. So this ends the second part of my talk. I hope that this gives you a better idea of the evolution of the decision-making process, going back to even before the League of Nations until today, and particularly the evolution in the United Nations and how it's moved away from voting and why the consensus process is so important in the United Nations and in capturing the spirit of the United Nations. I hope you feel that you've learned a few things from this, and now I'm open the floor for questions.
Yes, I have some questions. Do we have a minimum and maximum number of students to join as a delegation? Sorry about that.
What was your question?
Yes, do we have a minimum or maximum number of students to join as a delegation?
No, you can have as many students as you want, but do know that however many students, there is no limit, and we welcome as many as you would like to participate in this. But do know that we will be assigning your students to different simulations so that all of your students will not be assigned to the same simulation or the same UN body. Some of them may be assigned, let's say, to the General Assembly, others may be assigned to the Security Council, and so forth. And this, again, is and one of the things, through the feedback we get after conferences, is one of the things that students value is the diversity of the conference and the ability to interact with students from other schools and other countries. So your students, the students that you will be registering from your school, will not be together in the same simulation. And it's another reason why there is no limit to how many students you can have register for the conference. Are there any questions on what I talked about in the first part, but specifically any questions about the decision-making process at the UN? Are you clear about why we are following this process in our simulations and the importance of why consensus and the difference that the consensus process makes when you compare it to how traditional model UNs go about making decisions, which is entirely by voting? When I speak to model UNs around the world, they are quite surprised to find that the UN, for the most part, has abandoned making decisions by voting. They feel that what they learned through traditional model UN is the way the UN actually functions, and their first reaction is quite surprised, to be quite surprised by it.
Yeah, actually, I kind of wanted to also touch on that real quick because, Bill gave you a good history background and why it's so important. But so with your students how impactful it is. As I mentioned, I did do Model UN in college, but I did it on the other side of the basis where it was completely on voting. And then I started working for Wyman before I became a full-time staff for them as a volunteer. And I got to see this new process. And at first I was kind of shocked. And when I found out, like Bill said, I found out that this is the actual process because it wasn't the way I was taught. But then I started to see the impacts of it. It made students better diplomats. They had better negotiation skills. They really tuned into their listening skills. They were taking time to think before they spoke. It was less of, let me generate a whole bunch of signatures and get my resolution on the floor and hope all my friends that I've made in conference have vote on it. it's a discussion. We take this line by line and we really look at the wording, and it really develops, I think, skills better. I kind of wish that I would have found this format quicker in college, but I do see why it's so valued, and this is why I chose to work with this organization versus other Model UN conferences, is because of the impacts it has on the students.
Thank you, Bill and Mariah. I think there's no more questions. I also was shocked when I talked to Bill about it, because I also participated as a MUN coach in WIMUN, the Hague International Model of the United Nations, for 2 years, a different model of the United Nations at university and with the schools. And I understand now why this is the best way for students to learn to work with consensus. So I think it will be very good and very valuable for our students to know people from all over the world in this pandemic and in this situation. And we hope to see you there. I don't know if, Bill, you have any final words?
Yes, just to give you an idea of the different things we'll be simulating. We're going to be, and I'm working on finalizing the topic, so I don't want to say anything yet about that. But in terms of the kinds of things we will be simulating, we will be doing a simulation of one of the committees in the General Assembly. We will be doing a simulation of one of the functional commissions of Ecosoc, probably the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. We will be doing the Human Rights Council. We'll be doing, I'm working now with the World Health Organization in Geneva so that we can put together an accurate simulation of the World Health Assembly. We're also going to be doing an informal plenary meeting of the GA, focusing on Security Council reform. We're also doing a simulation of the Security Council. So there's going to be a lot of different entities for students to choose from. And one of the benefits of being a partner, of ISA being a partner with WFUNA, is that your students are given priority in terms of their positions in the Security Council, for instance, for those that are interested in participating in that particular simulation. I'm just curious what your reaction, if any of you would be willing to share with me what your reaction is to what you've learned about how the UN actually functions. Are you surprised by what you've learned? Do you see the value in why the UN has moved away from voting towards a different negotiation process? I can say, having been allowed into these informal consultations between member states, it's really quite stunning and heartening to see different countries really make an effort to understand each other, as opposed to imposing decisions on each other, which is what often happens in traditional Model UN. To hear them behind the scenes really try to understand the position of another country and define common ground and compromise. It really gave me a lot of hope to be able to see that firsthand, and unfortunately it's not something that you see during formal meetings which are broadcast in the UN. It's something that I've only witnessed during these informal meetings. So it's something that I'm trying to bring to students, and it's really a lifelong skill. I really feel that if we are to achieve a culture of peace around the world, we need to build our skills to be able to listen to each other better, to really understand and respect our differences. So again, I'm really curious if any of you would like to share your reaction to what you've learned today.
I think there are no comments.
Okay. Well, that's great.
I want to thank you, Bill, and also the schools that want to participate to get in contact with me, and I hope to send you the list of the schools shortly next week or the week after that. And we are looking forward to your webinars and to the explanations and whatever we need to know in order to participate. Here, John Lees is commenting, I am certainly now better informed than before. So,
thank you, Mr. Lee, and thank you, Edgardo, for the school association. And we really look forward to working with you. I am here to help you in any way, at any point. You can communicate with me through Edgardo or directly through me. I'd be more than happy to help you with any questions that you have during this process and to provide any support you may need to help your students. And again, we look forward to seeing you and them in our webinars and also at the conference at the very end of October. So thank you again.
here are some comments. Bill, it said, the consensus notion is also very European. Also a question from Argentina. Will you be sharing the PowerPoint with us? And Alicia is saying, our students became much more diplomatic after the last year conference, and they were slightly taken aback by the competitive nature of the local conferences once we were back.
Interesting. Interesting. Great. Thank you for that.
About the PowerPoint, I think you will share it in the next webinar, right?
Well, the PowerPoint I'm not able to share, but I do give this basic introduction to all of the students before the conference anyway, so they will have an opportunity to learn all about the same things today.
Perfect. And also, this video will be recorded and be on the ISA YouTube channel for you to check and consult whenever you want. So thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Mariah, and we hope to see you in the very near future. Thank you.
Okay. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.